We welcome you to another Sunday School lesson. Sunday School is a blessing and gift from God. 2 chapters in Genesis covering Hagar's story must be heard. This is a story of faltered human compassion. Abraham had it briefly for both Hagar and Sarah, yet he let Hagar flee to near certain death in the desert. But another miracle happens. Hagar receives an unprecedented second annunciation. Alone in the merciless desert, an intensity equal to the mercilessness of Sarah and Abraham, Hagar plans her own death. But she cannot bear to watch her son die. Hagar wept. God heard, and called out to Hagar, "What troubles you, dear? Do not fear, God has heard your cry." Then God declares that Ishmael shall be a great nation, the same promise given to Abraham's descendants. Hagar's eyes were opened, and suddenly there was fresh water that would revive both son and mother, and 2 sons of Abraham are saved. Our lesson shows how God can use strife-ridden situations and turn them around for the faithful. Our first verse says, "The child grew and was weaned, and on the day Isaac was weaned Abraham held a great feast." When a child no longer depends on his or her mother's breast milk to sustain them, they are stopped from feeding on his mother's breast milk. Some ancients say children were not weaned until 12 years of age, and some say 5 years, but the most reliable research indicates an age of 3. Isaac was young, and Abraham gave a great feast to celebrate the occasion. Ishmael would have been about 17 at the time Isaac was weaned. Verse 9 says, "But Sarah saw that the son whom Hagar the Egyptian had borne to Abraham was mocking." At some point either during the feast or sometime later, Sarah saw Ishmael, the son of Hagar the Egyptian, which she had borne to Abraham, making fun of Isaac. It is not clear whether Sarah witnessed Ishmael mocking Isaac as part of children's playful behavior, mistreating his younger brother, or playing the part of Isaac, pretending to take Isaac's place as heir of the promises. Ishmael pretending to be Isaac and usurping his future role would explain Sarah's actions. Verse 10 says, "And she said to Abraham, 'Get rid of that slave woman and her son, for that woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac.'" Witnessing the mocking of her son Sarah in her anger, Sarah demanded that Hagar and her son be cast out because they will offend a Hebrew sense of justice. In her culture, she was within her rights as the primary wife, now that her own son had survived the early years of life. By expressing her demand in the words of God's earlier promise to Abraham, she effectively justifies her terrible demand. There was no way that Sarah was going to stand by and watch her son Isaac share Abraham's inheritance with Ishmael, who made fun of her son and whose mother Hagar despised Sarah. Verse 11 says, "The matter distressed Abraham greatly because it concerned his son." The depth of Abraham's pain is seen, for he thought Sarah's request was somehow unethical or illegal. No doubt Abraham had become attached to Ishmael over the past 16 years or so. Because of his love for Ishmael, Abraham was greatly distressed at the thought of sending him away from his home into an uncertain world. Verse 12 says, "But God said to him, 'Do not be so distressed about the boy and your slave woman. Listen to whatever Sarah tells you, because it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned.'" Abraham might have been tempted to reject Sarah's counsel, but instead he sought the Lord in the matter. Seeing the predicament that Abraham was in, God in his mercy said to him not to be grieved because of Ishmael and Hagar, his slave girl wife. The Lord commanded Abraham to do what Sarah wanted him to do because Isaac was the promised son, not Ishmael. It was God's plan to use Isaac to expand and bless Abraham's descendants. Verse 13 says, "I will make the son of the slave into a nation also, because he is your offspring." God also reassured Abraham that he would bless Ishmael, that he would multiply Ishmael and make him a great nation. The Lord told Abraham that he would do this because Ishmael is his descendant. In essence, God would make Ishmael a large nation because of Abraham. Verse 14 says, "Early the next morning Abraham took some food and a skin of water and gave them to Hagar. He set them on her shoulders and then sent her off with the boy. She went on her way and wandered in the desert of Beersheba." As soon as Abraham perceives that sending Hagar and Ishmael away was the will of God, he makes no objections, but silently does as he was told. Abraham got up early the next morning and gave Hagar some bread, and a large skin filled with water, that should have supplied their needs for several days until they would come upon an oasis or some other source of water. This bondwoman and her son were now wandering around in the desert of Beersheba, which was at the southernmost end of Canaan and was mostly desert. By sending Hagar and Ishmael away, God made sure that since Isaac, the promised son, had arrived, the potential threat to Abraham's inheritance by Ishmael was removed. Verse 15 says, "When the water in the skin was gone, she put the boy under one of the bushes." After Hagar was sent off wandering in the desert of Beersheba, finding sustenance for their survival in this environment would have been difficult. We see this in the fact that at some point they had run out of water. To protect her son from the heat and to avoid further dehydration, Hagar put the child under one of the bushes. Even on the hottest days, the shade from a tree or bush can provide some relief. Verse 16 says, "Then she went off and sat down about a bowshot away, for she thought, I cannot watch the boy die. And as she sat there, she began to sob." Now that all the water was gone, Hagar could expect nothing but the death of her son. Unable to bear the thought of watching her son die in the desert heat, she went about 100 yards from her son. Then she burst into tears, and sobbed wildly. Earlier, when Hagar ran away from Sarah, she was rescued by the angel of the Lord, and God promised her that he would multiply her son's descendants into a multitude. It is likely that she had forgotten the promise that God made to her. Even Christians are apt to forget God's former promises, especially when our present circumstances seem helpless. Verse 17 says, "God heard the boy crying, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, 'What is the matter, Hagar? Do not be afraid, God has heard the boy crying as he lies there.'" In their distress, God heard the voice of the boy, responded to his cries and rescued him. The Lord sent the angel of God to comfort her. Often when we are going through troubling times, God has to quiet our fears and calm us down before we can truly hear his words. God gave the boy the name Ishmael, meaning God hears. Hagar was to use this name because God was hearing the anguish of her heart and responding to it. Now again, God was hearing and responding, assuring her that she did not need to fear for her son. Verse 18 says, "Arise, lift up the lad, and hold him in thine hand, for I will make him a great nation." After reassuring Hagar, the angel of God told her to get up, lift Ishmael up from his place of distress and hold him in her arms. Once again, Hagar was given the promise, her son was not going to die, but he would live and become the beginning of an entire family group of his own, the Arab nation. Verse 19 says, "Then God opened her eyes and she saw a well of water. So she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink." God knows our needs and makes provisions for those needs to be met ahead of time. While Hagar may have thought that they had been aimlessly wandering in the desert, they were actually being led to the very place where their needs would be met. When the Lord opened her eyes, she could see the provision he was making for her and her son. She suddenly realized that there was a well of water nearby. Then she went, and filled the bottle with water, and gave the lad drink to quench his thirst. Once again, the Lord had met her needs. Our final verse says God was with the boy as he grew up. He lived in the desert and became an archer. God was with the boy and kept the promise that he made, to bless Ishmael. Hagar and Ishmael settled in the unpopulated region of the desert of Paran, southwest of Beersheba. As Ishmael grew, he became a bow hunter. This allowed him to hunt and provide food for himself and his mother. Scripture tells us that he lived to be 137 and was the father of 12 tribes, Genesis 25:12-17, the same number of tribes that would come from Abraham's posterity through his grandson Jacob, who also had 12 sons who became tribes. However, a prophecy about Ishmael said that he would be a wild man, his hand would be against every man and every man's hand against him. His descendants, the Ishmaelites, are said to be hostile toward Israel and God. Injustice and hope. In this lesson, we have seen how Abraham's life turned around when he chose to obey God under all circumstances and realized that his plans for him were best. God has special plans for each of us. He even has special plans for those we don't even like or love us. We saw this in Sarah's encounter with Hagar and Ishmael. When we look to God, we will see that He can take our worst situations and use them for our good and for His glory, Romans 8:28. Injustice and hope. 1. God can use any of our emotions to complete His plans, even anger, Genesis 21:8-10. Anger is a normal emotion, and there's nothing wrong with feeling mad. What counts is how we handle it, and ourselves, when we're angry. 2. Serving God in obedience does not mean we won't show normal emotions, Genesis 21:11-13. Trusting God is not about ignoring your feelings or emotions. It is living a life of belief and obedience to God even when it's difficult. 3. God's will often requires doing the hard thing and leaving the results to Him, Genesis 21:14. Doing hard things is taking action towards something that you know will not be easy, and yet the end result will far exceed the effort you will exert, and the pain you will suffer, because of God's presence. 4. Being under God's protection does not guarantee the absence of suffering, Genesis 21:15-16. Yet we are admonished to endure suffering when they come, without compromising our integrity. 5. God answers those who cry out to Him and rescues them in His time and in His way, Genesis 21:17-18. God's perfect timing does two things: it grows our faith as we are forced to wait and trust in God, and it makes certain that He, and He alone, gets the glory and praise for pulling us through. 6. God remembers and keeps His promises even when men do not remember them, Genesis 21:19-20. God never forgets His promises or His people. He is the creator of the universe. He doesn't suffer from memory lapses. We are truly glad you spent time to learn this lesson with us. We hope you are blessed and may share these with somebody else. Thank you very much. Have a great week, and God bless you always, dear brothers and sisters.